supposedly conservative Southern Baptist Convention affirms critical race theory and intersectionality as useful analytical tools. Someone is being made a useful tool, and we're going to talk about it today. Why is race becoming such a divisive issue lately, and what can we do about it? I'm Cody Libolt, and welcome to our monthly Open Hangout with Jacob Brunton. We host this for our YouTube channel viewers, and this presentation is made possible by our supporters at christianintellectual.com/Patreon. And I'd like to take a minute to say a special thanks to our $10 plus patrons. And that would include AD, Alan, Tony, Benjamin, Brian, CJ, David, Don, GS, as well as Kelly, Lance, Lewis, Luke, Matt, Nathaniel, Paul, Presby, Quentin, Rachel, Robert, and Ruben. That's a ton of people that are contributing to make this project a success. And because of that, because of their generosity, we're able to do these now as an open hangout. That means everybody is welcome to join. Jacob, let's lay the foundation for the discussion today. How is this even the discussion?
I had a number of thoughts on some contributing forces, and particularly contributing ideological forces that have brought us to the point of this sort of racial emphasis that we're seeing in the SBC and in America in general. And in a lot of ways, it's legitimate to say that this wouldn't be happening if America didn't have the deplorable past that we had with slavery, with chattel slavery, right? If America hadn't participated in that, then we wouldn't be going through a lot of this today. But that's not to say that it's justified, what we're going through today, that in some way, the origins of America and chattel slavery justify this racial emphasis today. It just means that it's sort of the instigator that causes a lot of people not to think very carefully, or at least it's one of the major instigators that make people not want to think very carefully about these issues. And I think that's the major problem, is that people aren't thinking very carefully, and they're letting sentiment and emotionalism and a sense, a very misplaced and unhealthy, and I would say ultimately wicked sense of pity override their rational faculties and override otherwise sound judgment and sound reason. And the reason I say that is because there are a number of very serious, irrational lines of thought that are sort of coming together in the current narrative or discussion, if you will, that on any other issue, we typically aren't as susceptible to. We're typically not this susceptible to irrationality on this level in these areas or on other areas, but we are in this area. And some examples of that are, one is what I would call the package deal of race and culture. We've got this idea that to criticize a culture is to criticize someone's race, which means to criticize their skin color and the biological way that they were born, the immutable things that they can't possibly change about themselves. And so we've got multiculturalism, which says all cultures must be viewed as equal because we want to view all races as equal. And you can see how that works itself out. But it's not the case that culture is immutable in the same way that race is immutable. And it's not the case that culture necessarily has to have a one-to-one correlation to race. We shouldn't talk about quote-unquote black culture or white culture or Mexican culture or whatever the case might be, because it's simply not the case that you have to adopt the same ideas and values and customs as the majority of people who share your skin color or who share your ethnic or genetic lineage. You can break from that. You can change cultures. And in fact, sometimes it's very good to change cultures. Sometimes it's very bad to change cultures, depending on if you're going from a inferior culture to a superior culture. But the point is that there are superior cultures and there are inferior cultures. There are objective standards for evaluating the value of human ideas and human values and human customs and human art even, right? There are certain things that are better for humans and for human flourishing and better for the glory of God and better for the church in certain cultures than in other cultures. And so we want to be able to judge between cultures, but we can't do that if we think that to judge cultures is to judge races or to judge ethnicities or to judge genetic lineages. But we have assumed that we've tied those two things together, and it's come to a point where we have to choose between being moral relativists or cultural relativists and being racists. And some people have said, all right, well, fine, then I'm just gonna be a racist. And you've got black racists who say, well, then I'm gonna be all about black culture and down with whitey. And then you've got white racists who are, white supremacists or white nationalists who will say that, oh, well, the white culture is inherently superior because they think of that as Western culture, they equivocate. And then they think that people who aren't white, who are ethnic minorities or racial minorities, you might say, are therefore inferior culturally, necessarily, and that, as though they can't change, as though it's not possible for them to adopt a superior culture, which is, it's just not true. So that's one of the major factors that's led to a lot of the confusion that we have today and a lot of the controversy. Another is, and this is again another form of sloppy thinking, it's the idea that you can attribute to a member of a group that which is true of the average of that group, right? So if you take a whole bunch of people, let's say a whole bunch of black people, and you run some statistical analysis and you plop out what is the average for black people regarding income, let's say. And you take that number and then you say, all right, well, this must be true of every given individual. You take any individual and they must have had the same problems or the same struggles or the same disadvantages as the quote unquote average member after a statistical analysis is performed. And it's just not sloppy. It's just not careful thinking. It's sloppy thinking. That's not the way that we should think statistically about anything. That's not the way that statistics should be used. And we tend to know that, and we tend to be able to correct ourselves on that in other areas of life. But when it comes to the racial issue, we tend to slough off the need to think carefully about how to use statistics, and we feel like we're being mean or potentially racist or not loving if we think rationally about something like that. Those are probably the two major ones. There are a number of others that we can get into, and I would love to get into some specific examples eventually as we go through the discussion. But I would say in general, a lot of this is just sloppy thinking. A lot of this is emotion-driven, pity-driven, sympathy-driven, sloppy thinking.
Thomas Sowell said the kind of society to which that leads is one in which a newborn baby enters the world supplied with prepackaged grievances against other babies born on the same day. And that's identity politics. That is a race-based outlook on the entire world and on entire society.
Yeah, and sorry, Cody, that reminds me of one other thing that I wanted to mention just as a preliminary way to think about and frame this issue. And that is, first of all, I don't particularly like the phrase identity politics. I know what people are getting at when they say that, but if we're going to be technical for a moment, I don't want to assume that this collective identity is accurately described as an identity for somebody, right? My identity is individual. It's who I am before God as an individual. It's not rooted in the average statistical analysis of white men who are in their early 30s, right? Like I'm a white man in my early 30s, and identity politics, the way that we talk about it today, would say, okay, then whatever's true of white men in their early 30s on average is your identity, Jacob Brunton. And I want to just reject that idea of identity altogether. That's not a proper way to think about identity. Identity is primarily individual, and I think that's another major problem we've run into here is we see people as demographics prior to seeing them as persons. We see someone's skin color prior to seeing them as an individual person. We see someone's gender prior to seeing them as an individual person. And that's a really unhealthy and unbiblical and irrational way of thinking about people.
And that can also involve somebody thinking about themselves in that way. That's not a good thing. When you think of yourself as primarily, I am the person who has been victimized because of this quality about myself. I got teased for being short, or I got rejected for being a certain color, or for English was my second language, and therefore I've been treated differently. Now, you may have been treated differently. You may have been put down. But when somebody begins to think about themselves primarily as I am a person who is treated as a victim, is victimized, that's not a productive outlook for your own life. And it's especially damaging when entire groups of people begin to associate on the basis of their shared grievance. So, Jacob, I wanted to set the foundation of our discussion in terms of why this month are we talking about this? The Southern Baptist Convention happened a week and a half ago, and they voted on Resolution 9, which means that the delegates that were sent by churches from the largest denomination of Protestant Christians within the United States, they voted to affirm a resolution that said that critical race theory and intersectionality, while not coming from the Bible and perhaps having some concerns and problems, they are still useful as analytical tools. And you can just Google search SBC 2019 Resolution 9 if you want the exact wording. This has created quite a stir. Even during the annual meeting, there was a lot of discussion. There, gentlemen like Tom Buck and Tom Askell and others who were opposed to it spoke out and were pretty much ignored because the composition of the resolution committee did not allow for that kind of change to be made. So there has been a lot of pushback since then. For instance, a professor at Southern Seminary in Kentucky, his name is Mark Coppinger. He wrote about how intersectionality and especially this whole mindset of identity politics is not something that we as Southern Baptists ought to be affirming in any way. And even the president of that seminary, Al Mohler, went on a podcast that he has, and he explained his concerns about identity politics. Now, his concern was identity politics is just plain bad fruit, and that bad fruit comes from critical race theory and from intersectional theory. And so to the extent that they're creating this bad fruit, we ought to really be concerned about those theories as well. I would argue he could have gone further in his criticism, and he could have expressed concern about the people, not just the ideas, but the people that seem to be making a concerted effort to push this into seminaries. For example, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, to make it part of the curriculum. But everybody's in a difficult position when the goal is to get everybody moving forward in a certain direction. You have to be aware of what you say and what you don't say, and what kind of damage it's going to do and for what purpose. So it's a difficult time that the Southern Baptist Convention is in, but this is representative of a broader conversation, discussion, debate going on in the United States. How much should we consider racial grievances in the past as being a way of looking at society? How much should we consider them as being a way of looking at what kind of laws we need today? Should there be race-based reparations, financial payments from the federal government by tax money to people who not only were not slaves, but don't even have any ancestors who were slaves? How is that to be determined? Is it just to even wrong someone else in order to right some other third wrong? Those are the kinds of issues that we are concerned about. So, Jacob, we'll in this discussion, we'll be looking at the big picture of why is this possible that the United States has got to be so divided on race? Big picture, tell us, why did this happen?
Well, like I said, a lot of it is we had a sense of sentiment, and rightly so, towards Black people historically because of the way that they were treated in the past in this nation, both in slavery and under Jim Crow, that there is a righteous sense of that they were wronged, and justice means righting that wrong. And I think fighting the Civil War, in which many Americans lost their lives, was one major step in justly trying to right that wrong. I think ending Jim Crow laws was another major step in righting that wrong. I think the civil rights movement, by and large, there were some problems with it, and that's where a lot of these problems that we're seeing today began in seed form, and they're coming to fruition now. But the attempt to get rid of Jim Crow laws, to get rid of legalized segregation and legalized racism, which is actual systemic racism, by the way, right? Systemic means built into the system, and racism means assigning undue value or significance to someone's skin color. Jim Crow was systemic racism. Chattel slavery was systemic racism. And so the battle in the country to get rid of those things was a just and righteous battle to make things right for the Black people who had been victimized, and very, very wrongfully so. And so I think we have a sensitive conscience when it comes to those things. I think you see that with a lot of the older generation who grew up with when a lot of those things were going on in society, when there was still actual systemic racism like Jim Crow laws going on in society, or there was still open and flagrant racism by their grandparents, say. A lot of people who grew up around that atmosphere have a righteous sensitivity toward racism, toward the evil of racism, and they should, because racism is evil, it's wicked. But unfortunately, and in a sense, unrighteously, many of those men and women have allowed that sensitivity towards racism to soften them towards reason and to automatically accept the accusation of racism and automatically assume that racism exists anytime someone who has a minority skin color is wanting to claim it, for fear of participating in their ancestors' sins of overt actual racism. And I can understand why they feel that way. I can understand why they're tempted in that way. But that doesn't mean that it's not a temptation that they must flee, that they must fight. And the fact that they haven't fought that temptation, the fact that they've succumbed much to that temptation, is in large part the reason that we're seeing the chaotic evil running rampant in our culture today. If these godly men and women had withstood that temptation, then they wouldn't be delivering us over into this chaos and this evil that we're seeing all around us today.
There's a political reason why race has become something that we're talking about constantly, but not just race. Also, how are women treated in society? Are women victimized? If so, and to the extent that it is so, we ought to be talking about it. But this has become an issue on the forefront recently. So the treatment of women, the treatment of racial minorities, and not just that. There's other issues as well, and that's why we have the term intersectionality, because you can be persecuted or put down on multiple criteria. But there is something that all of these different grievance type ways of thinking about it have in common. And one thing that they have in common is that they divide people into groups. And when you divide people into groups, then you can reorganize them into groups the way that you want to as a political activist. You can get people convinced that that they don't have something in common with this group, but they do have something in common with this group. And so in the modern Democratic Party, for instance, this is the party of Muslims who feel that they are persecuted around the world. And it's also the party of feminists, which is a striking conjunction of two different groups, given that traditionalist Islam is not friendly toward feminist ideology, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. But they're considered to be a persecuted group, a fragment of the world that has a grievance against a certain other group. And by uniting all these different fragments together, they are going to be able to create a political bloc. And I think that that's a big part of the reason why you have this expanded discussion today about grievances of one kind and another. And it almost doesn't matter what the grievance is. What matters is that there is a grievance. And if you can get people to feel alienated from the mainstream, and you can get enough of those people to feel that way, and then you form a power block, I think that to a large degree, the people that are leading these movements understand this, and that they are acting in a Machiavellian way. That is to say, they are willing to ally themselves with people with whom they don't intend to agree long term, for the sake of conquering a short-term opponent. And the short-term opponent is the American Constitution and those who uphold it. They want to create a different kind of political system that is going to be more socialistic, more statist. And the people that are standing against them typically are going to be traditionalists. They're going to be fundamentalist Christian or mainstream Christian. A lot of them happen to be white. A lot of them happen to be male. So their enemy is that. And when they aim all of their efforts against that one enemy, they're willing to use any talking point that comes their way, because the issue is never the issue with these people. That is the deconstructionist mindset played out in 2019.
Yeah, and notice that as you pointed out, Cody, there's abundant contradiction in the current ideology of intersectionality, grievances, and things like that, or grievance studies. And the example you pointed out is Muslims and feminists sort of being viewed as allies or being viewed as similarly oppressed peoples. But feminists aren't viewed as oppressed by Muslims, only by non-Muslims and others. And then another example is Muslims and homosexuals, right? The sexual revolution has created in America and in the West largely a huge swell of support for LGBTQ plusism, and that's completely inconsistent with the sympathy that they have for Muslim cultures, which throw gay people off of buildings, and yet they have sympathy towards both, and they aren't bothered by the cognitive dissonance, and that's because their problem or their goal is not to avoid cognitive dissonance. Their goal isn't cognitive at all. It's all emotion based. The fact that they allow these contradictions, these very obvious contradictions, reveals that they're not concerned about reason. In fact, their only concern about reason is to destroy it. And that's why it's so important for those of us who are seeing it and want to stop it to gird out the loins of our minds, so to speak, and to use reason and to apply reason to all of this relentlessly. Because that's their only weapon. The only thing that unites the sympathy for Muslims and the sympathy for LGBTQ plusism and the sympathy for racial minorities and the sympathy for quote unquote downtrodden women and things like that, all of it, the only thing that unites it is a mindless, irrational sense of sympathy. The only thing that powers it, that allows it to have the might that it has in American politics and increasingly in the church, is this overwhelming sense of feeling sorry for people. And when we allow the sense of sorrow, the sense of sympathy, the sense of pity to overwhelm our rational faculties, then as we're seeing, anything goes. Any mix of unholy, evil contradictions goes when you give in to that sense of sympathy.
So we should, before we open up for questions, Jacob, I suggest let's just lay out a very summarized case for why not only and you've explained why these opponents, these intersectional critical race theory opponents, are irrational, but why is it rational to affirm the things that you affirm on these topics? On these topics, could you summarize what it is that you affirm and the defense of it?
So on the racial issue, which is I think the primary thing that's sort of the gateway drug to all of this, especially for Christians, the thing that we would affirm primarily is that people are first individuals before they are members of a group, whether it's a racial group or a cultural group or a sexual gender group or anything else. People are first individuals, and the number one way that we should view people in society is as individuals. Whenever I meet a Black person, my mind should be, it's a person. I'm meeting a person, an image of God. Their skin color has no significance. And in fact, that's what we would say about skin color. Skin color should have no more significance than height or hair color or eye color. There is some aesthetic value to it in that, wow, look, God's created an abundance of different types of people that look differently. And when you put it all together, there's an aesthetic harmony, and it's good to appreciate that. So in that sense, we don't want to be colorblind. But when it comes to morally significant categories, we absolutely do want to be colorblind. We ought to be colorblind. And it is a shame, a moral shame on the church that we think it's wrong to be colorblind in moral senses today. That is absolutely not true. When it comes to injustices that have been perpetrated against people, first of all, justice and injustice are individual things. They can happen in a systemic way, but it's in a systemic way against individuals. So whenever we're asking the question of whether or not someone has been the victim of injustice, the question is not what color is their skin or what is their gender. The question is, has this individual person been a victim of injustice? And if so, which injustice? Be specific. And then if they have been a victim of injustice, of a specific injustice, then we ought to fight against that specific injustice on their behalf. And that would be a form of quote unquote social justice, of seeking justice in society, seeking justice on behalf of other people. But we absolutely should not think of it in terms of collectives, whether racial or gender or whatever else. So the primary thing that we affirm is individualism on these issues. And the reason that we affirm that is because the human person is primarily an individual. Only the things that make man unique, the things that make man the imago Dei rather than a beast of the fields, are his rational faculty and his ability to value based on his rational faculty, his ability to judge and discern, and then to act on that discernment, to use his body to interact with the world. Those are the things that make us imago Dei. That's what makes man man. And only individuals have that. Black society, quote unquote, does not have a mind. It does not have a body. It does not have a will over and above or apart from the individual wills of everybody that you're talking about and the individual minds of everybody that you're talking about. So man is first individual before he enters into social relationships. And those social relationships are completely dependent upon and reducible to his agreement in entering into them. So that would be the underlying philosophy and rationale that we would bring to this discussion, which is individualism. And we think that that is the ultimate solution in solving all of these problems. And we think that that's rooted primarily in a biblical worldview based on man as the imago Dei.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, if we had been at the SBC annual meeting, we would have definitely voted no. And in fact, we have somebody that's on the video right now, not going to jump on, but they were there and they voted no. And then when there was a suggestion to change it, they were an advocate of that. Something to know about the way that the things went down at the convention, that resolution was originally submitted by somebody who was anti the social justice advocate type stuff, anti-Marxism, anti-CRT, anti-intersectionality. And the amendment was written, or the resolution was written to say, we reject these. But the president this year of the Southern Baptist Convention appoints a group of people to be on the resolution committee. And the people that he appointed are influenced by James Cone. They're the kind of people that have bought into critical race theory. And so they, in a way that was unethical, took the suggested resolution and changed it so that it said the exact opposite of the intention. They communicated that we affirm that it can be used sometimes, when the original resolution was that it ought not ever to be used and that it's ridiculous.
Wow.
Completely unethical, but representative of the kind of leadership that you see today in the SBC. I would recommend go to capstonereport.com and you can find the latest probably 5 to 7 articles. There's several in there that very clearly describe what happened. You can find the report of the person who originally wrote the resolution and submitted it. And you can find the report of the reactions from Coppinger, from Mueller, And it's good to know what's going on in the world. All right, so we're going to open up the discussion now to the questions that, first of all, that I've already seen in the comments. And Jacob, I'll read you these rapid fire and we can just go through them kind of quick.
Sure.
So here's one that's pretty useful. We are often accused of being unsympathetic because we seek to be logical. And it's as if those two things were opposite from each other. What's your easy response to that?
I mean, how can any Christian think that way? How can any Christian think that logic, reason, truth are opposed to true love and compassion and mercy? I mean, if you think that way, then you might as well be a Marcionite who's going to try to divide up the Old Testament and the New Testament, because in the Old Testament, God was all about truth and logic and justice and wrath. And then the New Testament, God's all about mercy and love and sympathy and all those things. That it's such an elementary and naive and immature and honestly just unpalatable, disgusting view of life, of reality, and especially of God and of Christianity. If you think that you can't have a white hot passion for logic and truth and justice, and at the same time have a white hot passion for mercy and compassion and sympathy for the actual downtrodden, then you do not know the God of the Bible. I'm sorry, but you don't. And you need to go there and learn.
Well said. All right, this is an anonymous question. It says, is that Federalist article that came out this last week about Resolution 9 a sign that our message is getting out there? And I would say yes. Go to the Federalist, and you can see an article from this is not written by an SBC person, but they are seeing what's happening, and they're very concerned.
Yeah, who was it that wrote that? Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't remember.
Okay, there's some good writers there. Anyways.
I believe it was a Lutheran, so somebody that's conservative, but that is also following the progress of bad ideas within other denominations. I'm not sure. You'd have to check. Jerry had commented, it's easy for feminists and Muslims to be united because they are united in their grievance against Christianity. That's the common theme. I mean, think about who qualifies on the scorecard for intersectionality and who doesn't. That will tell you who is the villain in their story. Mm-hmm. And they're united in hatred. And he wrote, on the intersectionality scale, the Muslims will win. As in England, you can see what's going on in England if you follow the news at all. The LGBTQ curriculum will win. But then you compare them, and he points out if you have a fight between those two, eventually they're going to be fighting with each other within the school system. There is really no winner in this kind of approach.
And I would say it's not just Christianity that they are united in their grievance against. It's a little bit broader than that. It's Western civilization as such, and Christianity is viewed, rightly so, as an integral part of Western civilization. But you look at even non-Christians who suffer in similar ways, in similarly statistical and seemingly systemic ways, like Asians in the university system, right? And they aren't viewed with the same sort of sympathy. They don't get the same grievance points, and it's because they're achieving, that they're assimilating into Western civilization, and they're doing well. They're prosperous. And so the war that these guys are waging is against prosperity. It's against civilization. It's against Western civilization, against living well, against human flourishing in the rational, objective sense, right? It's against everything that is good and noble and honorable and glorious about Western civilization, whether in historical Europe or in recent historical America. That's the thing that they are united against. And the only thing that unites them is not a rational or objective principle. The only thing that unites them is this blind nihilistic hatred for Western civilization.
It's a good word to understand, nihilism. Just Google search it and look at it. It can mean several different things. The belief that there is no such thing as values, or the desire to destroy for the sake of destruction. All right, Matt, let's bring you on. You were at the SBC meeting.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, I was there.
Tell us about your experience.
Well, it was, it was wonderful. Pastors Conference was great. First day and a half of the convention, there was a lot of unity. All the resolutions, passed 99%. You always have one or thanks. Got those next time. One or two folks, would always disagree, but when it came to Resolution 9, we were already over time, and so there was one of the biggest problems that I and several others were upset with was that they curbed debate on the issue. They tried to lump 9 through 13 all together, like they were all just going to sail through. But 9 was very, very controversial, and I was sitting in the back. And I can tell you the resolution after discussion, we were granted 5 more minutes for discussion, but then he said, no, we're going to vote immediately. So it was very confusing because we were already over time for the whole convention was supposed to dismiss. They didn't allow any more discussion. They said we're going to vote it up or down. And the amendment failed about, I would say, at most 60-40. It might have been 55-45, but the amendment did fail. It wasn't close enough for them to do ballot. And then the resolution passed with the same margin. So it was a very divided convention on that issue, and really that issue only over 2 days of a lot of spirit of unity. So it was a little disconcerting as everybody kind of left the convention in disarray, talking about intersectionality and critical race theory, terms which most of the messengers had never heard before Wednesday. I would say.
Thank you for sharing about that, Matt. Jacob, next question is: have you guys seen any tactics that have had more success than expected for bringing people who care about the church to our understanding of the significant liberal ideology infecting it? Every time I have to explain to someone, I feel like I need a conspiracy theory whiteboard with red strings tying Russell Moore to Sam Alberry to George Soros to Beth Moore and so on. So, Jacob, do you know of anybody personally that you've spoken to about this that has at least moved somewhat in their understanding because of your work?
I know of quite a few people, both online and in person, just that have thanked me for ongoing conversations that I've had with them along these lines about these issues. And I think the number one thing to do is to just help people to think clearly about these things. Well, like I said before, the only power this has is the power of emotion in order to obfuscate reason and rationality and the truth. But if you just have a calm and clear and laser focused discussion about what are the facts, what is the truth of this matter, let's put all sympathy and emotion aside for a second. Let's try to figure out what's true, and then let's base our emotional reaction on what's true rather than allowing our emotions to dictate to us what we're going to accept as true and false, right? If you try to approach it like that yourself, and you communicate to others that you are inviting them to approach it like that as well, and you have that expectation, you make it clear that in this conversation we're going to have, my expectation is going to be, we want to figure out what's true no matter what it is, and then let our emotions follow suit rather than the other way around. If you maintain that expectation very clearly and you stick to it and you help them stick to it, I think that makes all the help in the world. I haven't had to go deeply into conspiracy theories and break out whiteboards and red strings, and I don't think that it's necessary to. If you can stick to what are the problems with the ideology, just point out how does this make sense? Ask questions. Be innocent as doves and wise as serpents, and ask questions. Say, now wait a second. I see you're right. Statistically, this is the case. But how does it follow from that we ought to do X, right? Or I see that in the past, Black people have been abused by white people in systemic ways, like chattel slavery and like Jim Crow laws. And I agree, that's wrong, that's evil, that's systemic racism. But how does it follow from that when a Black person gets shot by a white cop, that we should automatically assume it's the same sort of thing going on? Why should we assume that? And put the onus on them to give a rational explanation. And if they can't or they refuse to give a rational explanation, make it clear to them that they are the ones in the wrong. say, I'm going with Jesus. I'm going with truth. I'm going with reason here. I'm not going to give into my emotions. And brother, I'm going to pray for you because you're giving into your emotions. And I can't go with you in that direction. Make it clear to them that they're not thinking right.
The basis for the discussion is we are both oriented toward discovering truth. And you have to approach it by saying, there are things that I may not know. And I am willing to listen to the arguments that you're going to make that perhaps I've not heard, or the accounts of things that have recently happened that I'm not aware of. I'm open to the facts, but I'm going to expect the same thing from you. I'm going to expect that there will be reciprocity in this relationship, that I can make an argument logically about something and you'll consider it, you'll give it weight. And as well as nobody's entitled to their own facts, we have to be, both of us, willing to orient to reality. I think that's generally the best approach. We had another anonymous comment that something to be aware of when you are in a discussion with leftists, this may be a good rhetorical point, is that leftists historically, the Democratic Party historically, have been the ones that instigated systemic oppression and racism. You have to understand that that's part of their history, and that's probably partly why they are waving the sign that says, we don't oppress, and why that's just so much on their mind. There's a lot of projection going on. Mm-hmm. But you can point out to that history. You can say, there's a certain set of ideas about inferiority and superiority of different people groups that has led to certain policies. Do you want to know what those policies were and the effect they had on people? Are you interested to know which people had those policies? And those are some really important facts that you could bring. The systemic oppression that we see today, we would not say that there's systemic oppression necessarily within, say, like corporate hierarchies, or systemic oppression in some of the ways that leftists would want to claim. You know, for instance, the pay gap or something like that. Not totally convinced that that kind of reasoning works, but there is systemic oppression on the basis of democratic policies. One after another, minimum wage hurts Black people, or public schooling clearly hurts Black people, and on and on. That's systemic oppression. That's what it is.
Yeah, although I wouldn't say that that's systemic racial oppression, because in order to be a systemic racial issue, race has to be some part of the actual system, right? And a good example of that today would be things like affirmative action, or like scholarships specifically for certain races and not for other races. That is systemic racism. That you're making race an essential factor in part of your system for how you're going to operate. That, by definition, is actual systemic racism. The mere fact that a policy happens to have negative consequences for more people of a given demographic than another is not in and of itself sufficient evidence to conclude that systemic racism is taking place. It still might be unjust, but you've got to look at the actual policy and show how and why the policy is unjust. The mere outcome is not sufficient proof that it is unjust.
This would be a good time. If anyone has remaining questions, go ahead and drop them in the comment box, and we will try and find them and make sure we address them all. I did also want to give you an update on the progress of the film that we're working on, Enemies Within the Church, enemieswithinthechurch.com. In the last several days, we have opened up our funding campaign. It takes quite a bit of funding to create a high-quality film and get it in theaters across the country. And since opening the doors, we've had thousands upon thousands of dollars of people donating. We even had a gift of just $1,000, like from one person, because they believe in this so much, because somebody's doing the work to get this message out to the world. And I know a lot of people that may watch this video in the near future are feeling that same way. Man, if I could get this message into the world by any means. So please consider doing that, and be ready to look at the other people who are supporting projects like this, like For the New Christian Intellectual, or Enemies Within the Church, or statementonsocialjustice.com. Make it your priority to see who else cares about these things and to get to know them, so that you're not intellectually isolated, and so that you can do productive things. Out of the people that are watching right now, interacting with us, I know about half of you are outspoken, maybe more, outspoken on either Facebook, a blog, or different classroom environment, you have a stage of some kind. And I want to say thank you for doing what you can to get the message out, and keep doing that. Keep working to get the message out that the United States has good founding principles, individual rights.
The best in history.
We have something to stand for, and it's not just that we are opposed to progress. We are in favor of individual rights. And this whole critical race theory, it's a way of deconstructing what the United States is and what is good about the United States. Critical race theory, if you're not familiar with it, definitely search Neil Shinby's website, and he'll explain it from a Christian point of view. He'll take it apart and say this is why we're concerned about it. But it is deconstructionism, it's postmodernism. It's the idea that rational discourse is not possible because there's different groups, and you analyze everything in terms of power and oppression and victims. And there's more to it that you could know, but there's really not a whole bunch more that you need to know to understand that it is from this train of thought that everything that is being poured into the minds of young people in universities today comes. And it's so when somebody comes out and says, I'm a victim, I spent $100,000 on an art degree and now I don't have a job, and somebody owes me providing for me, they were taught something from either critical theory or critical race theory or grievance studies. And it's destroying our country. Just to be honest, it is.
We should not grant the title of progress to these Neanderthals, and that's what they are. This is a gross, primitive, tribalistic, animalistic way of interacting with other human beings. The truth is that those of us who are fighting for Western civilization, for the principles of the founding fathers, for reason and truth and logic, we are the only ones that are truly for progress. And we ought to fight with that conviction in mind.
Wonderful. We got another comment here that says, did you see the Capstone Report article? An ERLC fellow said that the idea of a Christian America is unchristian. So, yeah, there is a group of people within church leadership, within the Christian publishing world today, that they do not want Christians supporting the ideals of the founding fathers. And they don't think that those ideals have anything to do with Christianity. We're talking about a basic biblical illiteracy at the highest levels of religious leadership among conservatives in this country, to be able to be unaware what Scripture teaches about private property and individual rights. That's what we're fighting. Guys, I want to challenge you. It's a worthy war. See what you can do to fight that war even to a greater extent today than you have so far. I'll leave the closing thought to you, Jacob.
Be encouraged. There's that saying, being on the right side of history, and it's kind of trite. And we don't know if we're going to be on the winning side of soon history, or history within the next century or a couple centuries, but we do know that from an eternal perspective, we are on the right side of eternal history, because we are fighting for those things that King Jesus is fighting for, that he is advancing in his kingdom. So whether we win or not in this temporal sense, we are fighting an eternal battle for the temporary good of our brothers and sisters and for our own selves and for our own lives. We're fighting for all that is good and true and holy in eternal senses and in temporal senses. And so be encouraged. Let that drive you and give you passion and help you not to give up in the face of the nihilistic lust for destruction and deconstruction all around you.
Thank you guys for joining today.